Okay, so let's wrap up really quickly the rest of this particular unit, and then we'll get into clips of examples. Make this a little bit, all this chit chat a little bit more tangible. Okay. So we're making what's called a product mix decision. Now, if you remember from your 113, Finance 113, or the soon-to-be named Management Science 103, because a couple things were changed in there, we did the product mix in the linear programming segment, right? We used the simplex method and that kind of stuff. We were essentially using the bottleneck method without saying the word bottleneck method, okay? This traditional method kind of sucks. So we're going to continue on with that vein, except now we're going to explicitly acknowledge it. When we did this in 113, and when we're doing this here in 352, contribution margins are so important. Okay, if we remember contribution margins, that's just price minus the direct product costs. Okay, skipping overhead and all those sort of some, to a finance person like me, arbitrary allocations that accountants do to these things. But anyway, we're going to focus in on contribution margin, price minus direct product costs. So that's going to be our key metric. It was our key metric when we did this in 113. Key metric here as well. Okay, so that key metric of contribution margin per minute, contribution margin per, well, related to what? Right? We don't, the traditional method just says, hey, focus in on the contribution margin, and that's it, stop. But all the way through this whole unit, it's bottleneck, watch the bottleneck, manage the bottleneck, the theory of constraints, which is really deals with the bottleneck. Everything's been about the bottleneck. Do we deviate from the bottleneck now? No, we do not. Okay, so when we start talking about that contribution margin in relation to what? In relation to the bottleneck resource. Okay, in relation to the bottleneck resource. Now, that could be per minute of processing time at the bottleneck. It could be per unit of the bottleneck resource, depending on what is the bottleneck resource. The bottleneck resource does not have to be time at a machine. It could be the number of subcomponents that we have. Okay, so it can be units. It's not bound to be time. But I just expressed it as time because often it is. And just trying to keep it from being complicated. I make it complicated in my verbal explanation. So step one, we calculate the contribution margin per minute or per unit of the bottleneck resource. Step two, we allocate the resources to the products in the order decided in step one. Well, what order did we decide in step one? Bigger contribution margins are preferred to smaller contribution margins. We start off by allocating those resources to the products that have the biggest contribution margin. Okay. And we do that until we've made all of the that highest contribution margin per unit of bottleneck. We made that product as much as we possibly can, and the limit typically in that case will be whatever the market will bear. How did we know what the market would bear? Forecasting, right? And so we make as much as we possibly think we can sell. And then if we have any resources left, we go to the product with the second highest contribution margin per unit of bottleneck resource, and we try to make as much of it as we possibly can. And we keep doing that until, well, we run out. Now, we won't be able to make everything, because otherwise we wouldn't have had a constraint. So we can't make everything, and so we now decide what we've been able to make. And perhaps if we have a few products, and you see this in the examples, we'll make all of A, all of B, a sum of C, or all of A and a bit of B and none of C. Right, so it could be anything. It's kind of exciting. It's like unwrapping a present. Ooh, what's going to be the most profitable mix that we could possibly produce? What will it be? What will it be? Right. So very, very exciting there. And then we find out, well, how much money did we actually make? Okay, so not a hard process. Okay, but we'll do some examples, kind of solidify this approach. Okay, so last thing up, it's not super important, is the drum buffer rope systems, and it's based on the theory of constraints. And we're just trying to regulate the flow of work in progress, WIP, at the bottleneck. And we talked about this a little bit, is that we want a little bit of inventory in front of the bottleneck because we don't want to ever starve the bottleneck, just in case they happen to, variability works in our favor and the bottleneck resource is able to process more than is typical. We want to have that extra inventory available for them if that happens. But at the very least, we want to ensure that, and then just in case there's variability in the process before that bottleneck resource, right? Maybe they were a little bit light. They couldn't produce as much as they normally could. Machine breakdown, somebody got sick, COVID, right? That throws a monkey wrench into everything. And so they're not able to process enough to send to the bottleneck resource. The bottleneck resource, we never want it idle, because if it's idle, that restricts the throughput of the entire line, the entire whole process, the whole system is affected if that bottleneck resource goes idle. So we never want that to happen. So sometimes we have a little inventory there. And so this drum buffer rope system is there to say, hey, you know what, the bottleneck schedule, it beats the drum, like the drum, like in the boats. And I don't even know if dragon boats do this too. It's been so long, but you got those beats, they're rowing, boom, 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 boom. And that gives you the cadence, boom, boom, boom. Right, of the row, and so I got that drum, and that the bottleneck is the drum. It dictates the scheduling. Its schedule dictates everything for everybody, right? Because again, we subordinate other processes to the bottleneck, so we don't have a big inventory buildup by that bottleneck resource. So the drum is boom, ba-dum, ba-dum, setting the pace to the process, to the whole system. The buffer is that little bit of inventory, so that bottleneck resources is never starving for resources, regardless of how it's caused. Okay, so we have the buffer, inventory management, next unit coming up, all that kind of good stuff. The rope is sort of like what ties it all together. How do we communicate that the bottleneck resource is the buffer is a little low, or the bottleneck resources is working harder than usual, not working as hard as usual. Another resource that's supplying the bottleneck resource is got problems. This is just the rope. Just means the communication process. How do the different aspects of the product or service that we're creating, the different activities in that, communicate with each other to let the other activities know that, hey, we're a little bit behind, or we're a little bit ahead, or what have you. So it's just a communication mechanism. Okay. And again, just the focus is always on utilizing the bottleneck resource, right? We're focused like a laser beam on that bottleneck resource, because that's what's dictating our throughput, and that's what's really limiting our profitability and our efficiency, right? Is what's going on at that bottleneck. Okay, so now we're ready to roll into examples.